Before the Marvel Cinematic Universe dominated the Hollywood scene in its prime, before superhero movies became as culturally relevant as they are today, there was Spider-Man. Now, it wasn't the first comic book film, hell, it wasn't even the first successful one, but it was a defining moment in the history of these things. One that proved superheroes could be a cinematic force rather than just being a niche. It's been over 2 decades since this film released, and even today it holds a special place in the genre. It was this cultural moment that really changed how studios and the general audience viewed how comic book adaptations could be done. And yet, as superhero movies have grown more interconnected and more complex, something about Spider-Man continues to remain uniquely compelling. There isn't any multiverse spectacle, no elaborate franchise setup, no endless teasing of cameos and sequels. Spider-Man, both as a film and a trilogy, is a simple, self-contained story about Peter Parker and the emergence of great power and responsibility, and maybe that's the magic in all of it. Today, superhero films almost always feel like they're pieces of something larger, released to tease characters for the next crossover, laying groundwork for a sea of sequels and an ever-growing cinematic universe that decays more with every release. This movie stands apart from that. It's a complete film. From beginning to end, it tells this clear, emotionally resonant story, one that doesn't need anything else to justify its existence. But before we get into the film itself, let's take a look back at the superhero landscape prior to its release. By the time Spider-Man hit theatres in 2002, superhero movies had existed for decades, but don't mistake that as me saying the genre was necessarily in a good place. The early success of films like Superman and Batman had proven that these heroes could thrive on the big screen, but constant missteps in the 90s resulted in this huge stumbling block. That's where films like Blade and X-Men come in. They were darker, more grounded takes on recognised heroes that found success by downplaying elements of their comic book origins. The decision to dress the X-Men in black leather was a statement, albeit a weird one, but a deliberate move away from the bright aesthetic that defined superheroes in the comics. For some reason, studios seemed to believe that these superheroes would not be taken seriously by the general audience without stripping away some of the more fantastical elements. But then, along came Spider-Man. The film never hid away from what it was. It wasn't scared of colourful costumes, exaggerated emotions, or comic book storytelling. It embraces everything about the character of Peter Parker, from his origin story to his rogues gallery, without feeling the need to apologise for it, and I adore that. More importantly, it didn't just prove that audiences were ready for a more grounded, mature superhero story, it set the whole damn standard for what one of these things could actually be. And it did all that without the need for a cinematic universe. One of the film's biggest strengths is the ability to tell a complete, emotionally satisfying story without an over-reliance on sequel hooks or franchise building. There is of course those references to Spider-Man related characters who aren't present here, but they're never teased with this coming soon feeling. In today's era of superhero cinema, every film seems weighed down by this promise of future content, and Spider-Man stands out in retrospect as a stark reminder of how powerful a self-contained narrative can be. It's an origin story in the truest sense, not just in how it introduces Peter and his powers, but in how it details that full transformation into Spider-Man. It begins with him as this awkward, struggling teen, and ends with him fully understanding what it means to be a hero. Every major event in the narrative feeds into that arc. Uncle Ben's death is ripped from the comics and the thematic context, teaching that lesson of responsibility. Norman Osborn's descent into insanity mirrors Peter and his struggle with power, and that final scene where Peter turns his back on the love of his life to embrace his role as Spider-Man cements an intense feeling of sacrifice. Unlike so many of the superhero films nowadays, Spider-Man doesn't feel like it's waiting around and saving its best elements for a sequel. There's a complete story here. There's no cliffhanger, no post-credit tease, no unanswered questions that leave a bad taste in the mouth. Now, of course, sequels did come, and we're gonna get onto those in the coming weeks. But it's not like it needed them. You know, if this was the only Spider-Man film that ever released, there wouldn't be a sense of longing to see a finished story, because we get that with this film. And it makes it so much stronger. By keeping the focus tunneled on Peter's personal journey, it avoids those pesky distractions that often ruin so many of the more recent films. It's a film that knows exactly what story it wants to tell, and it tells it with absolute clarity, and a large part of that has to go down to its director and his filmmaking genius. Spider-Man has a personality, and Sam Raimi's direction gives the movie a uniquely charismatic energy, blending sincerity, emotion, and even elements of horror into something that feels both timeless and unmistakably Raimi. From the first scene, it looks and feels like a comic book story. That dynamic camera work, the exaggerated zooms, and the kinetic action give the film this camp, larger-than-life quality. Scenes like the one with Peter discovering his powers or the Goblin creation and how it channels Raimi's horror past. It all showcases his ability to balance the spectacle of a superhero story with the raw emotions of a human one. Now, I know that CGI is present, but where the MCU will lean heavily into the spectacle of that, Spider-Man feels more tactile and hands-on. Many of those effects, especially in the action sequences, were done with real stunt work and in-camera magic, making the movement of Spidey feel physical in a way that still holds up. To speak a little more on the horror, because you know how much I love it, it adds an edge to the film that is unmistakable. The Green Goblin, for all of his campy charm, is surprisingly unsettling, with Willem Dafoe giving this unhinged, defining performance. His scenes talking to the Goblin persona in the mirror feel as though they're ripped straight out of a horror movie at times. That's not even to mention the final fight between Spider-Man and the Goblin. It's a climactic, brutal, bloody brawl that feels personal in a way that most superhero finales just don't. Raimi's style is a big reason why this movie works so well. Rather than feeling like a studio product, it feels like it has an identity, and in a genre that can often feel so similar, that's something that has to be celebrated. The heart of this entire thing is the character it's so tightly focused on, Peter Parker. His development from a reserved teenager to a selfless hero is the emotional backbone of this film and the trilogy. There's no convoluted setup, no competing subplots that dilute the growth, it's just this direct, emotionally resonant transformation that remains one of the best in any superhero media. His arc starts off with him as this shy, ordinary kid with a crush on the girl next door, something that I think a lot of people can relate to. He struggles with bullies and feels pretty invisible to the larger world. And when he gains those powers, it initially seems like the answer to all of those problems. To begin with, he uses them selfishly for personal gain, and that arrogance that comes with this leads to the death of Uncle Ben, a defining staple of the Spider-Man story. That moment is the turning point for Peter. It's that catalyst that kicks this entire legacy into action. It spawns the most important narrative element of the story, that needs to instill that level of responsibility that Peter has to take on, and from that point the film ensures that every major plot point only helps enhance that. Norman Osborn, his would-be mentor, represents a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of unchecked power, and acts as a direct parallel to Peter. Mary Jane represents the personal happiness that must be sacrificed when taking on the mantle of a hero. And in the film's final moments, when Peter walks away from her, from the one thing he's wanted ever since he met her, his transformation is complete. It's a shame when thinking that this kind of storytelling feels rare in modern superhero films, where the arcs tend to be stretched thin across multiple films, feeling hollow as a result of that. Spider-Man tells a full, satisfying story that completes his arc in 2 hours, allowing him to become that hero he was always meant to be. Circling back a little, superhero media has evolved dramatically since the debut of this film in 2002. The genre has expanded into these bloated, interconnected universes, with so many of the films and shows feeling like stepping stones to something bigger, rather than a story worth telling to begin with. And yet, despite all of the advancements made in visual effects, storytelling complexity, and blockbuster filmmaking, Spider-Man still stands out as one of the best examples on how to do it right. And this was 23 fucking years ago. One of the biggest reasons for that is the emotional sincerity present in the writing. Modern superhero films sometimes lean into self-awareness, humour, or irony as a way of acknowledging their own absurdity. This doesn't do that. It wears its emotions on its sleeve, unafraid of earnestness, whether it be Peter and his heartbreak, Norman and his tragic downfall, or hell, even Aunt May and her ability to always know what to say. The characters and their struggles are real, they're serious, and treating them that way is a large reason why audiences still connect with them. It also does benefit heavily from that simple, streamlined approach. It doesn't need to juggle multiple heroes, massive multiversal stakes, or excessive world building because none of it is present to begin with. It doesn't need any of that. Spider-Man is a film that anyone can pick up and watch at any time and experience a complete story without needing any additional context. And then there's the craftsmanship that continues to stand the test of time. Raimi's signature approach to filmmaking, the use of practical effects, and Danny Elfman's score give this film an identity that still holds up. It doesn't feel like a product of a shared cinematic universe because it's not. It's a story that was told because the story is made to feel like it matters. At the end of the day, Spider-Man continues to resonate with audiences because of its ability to tell a clear, concise story, and one that is more than capable of standing on its own. At the end of everything, Spider-Man is this timeless story about growing up, accepting responsibility, and the sacrifices that come with doing the right thing. Against the current climate of superhero films that are becoming more and more like jigsaw pieces, this remains a testament to the power of simplicity, the effectiveness of clarity, and the need for emotional depth. When we look at the legacy it's left behind, it's clear that this has shaped what superhero films can be in some sense, even if some of them don't choose to follow that. It sets a blueprint for making a blockbuster that doesn't just entertain, it makes you feel something. It continues to feel just as relevant today as it did when it first swung on to the big screen. As superhero movies continue to evolve, or devolve depending on who you ask, Spider-Man is a constant reminder that the best films aren't part of a bigger picture. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't these multi-film epics, they're simply ones told well, and Spider-Man is the perfect example of that.